Greetings, scholars. Welcome back. Today we're trying a little different visual system for you, trying to make these lectures easier to go down in your homes all by yourselves, trying to pay attention. I know that I get a bit more boring when I'm home all by myself, just trying to talk to, I know you, but nobody's there to ask questions or laugh at my kind of lame jokes. So, I think I can do it today because the Baroque is the exciting one. Finally, we've been in this class for 3 months. I know that the High Renaissance is the thing that we're working towards for the first half. And then I kind of give you a letdown on it was a couple decades, went by rather fast, and then here we are. We struggled through the Mannerism era. We saw that sort of angsty teen rebellion. Meanwhile, in the North, people were getting on and economic prosperity and whatnot, so that the angst just wasn't the same. Now here we are in the Baroque, and to me, this is where we finally make it in real art. The High Renaissance gives us that perfection of form. We get perfectly perfecting perfect. We get all of this how to show realism, how to show you exactly what we see. And then Mannerism says, yeah, but you can just see stuff. What about the stuff that you've never even imagined? Hieronymus Bosch and all of these sort of trippy, crazy things we've seen that are trying to elevate art to more than just documenting the natural world around us, but rather showing those heights of inspiration and ideas of human beings. But there was still that angsty avenue in Mannerism where we had to be rejecting the old ways. We had to be rejecting the High Renaissance so that we couldn't say okay, they had 10 good ideas, but the rest. Now in the Baroque, we can kind of calm down and look back and say, we loved what was happening with being able to perfect form, being able to show you exactly what we mean to show you. A person looks like a person, the sweat, the pain, the muscles. But we can also make it more than just a reenactment of a scene. We can add that sort of manneristic ideal of grazia. We can add that grace in, that beauty, that more than reality, that true art with a capital A. So to me, we made it through the High Renaissance. We made it through Mannerism. We've had almost 1,000 years in this semester so far, working towards the last stylistic era that we're going to cover in this semester. I think it's a brilliant place to end this semester. I didn't develop that umbrella idea of what 252 is, but it's perfect in that sense that when we move on into 253, you're going to see sort of remembering, rehashing, homages, nods towards everything that you've seen in 252, right? We get neo, which just means new, attached to pretty much everything that we see here. I was watching a great documentary on the neo-Gothic of the Romantic era, and how people just got obsessed with not necessarily the Gothic cathedrals that were still standing and operating. They were beautiful, but the ones that were abandoned, the ones that had broken and fallen down, the ruins. So there was sort of this, I think it was called ruin lust, where people just romanticize what it was like to live in that high pointy arched Gothic era. And that's sort of the beginning of the movement of what we have in modern Goths, not at all related to either the Gothic movement in art that we've studied, nor just like that one isn't related to the Goths, the people that, sacked Rome a few hundred years earlier. That's where that connection is. The Gothic cathedrals were not built by the Goths. They have nothing to do with them. That was just our nasty word for antiquated. And so this Romantic era revival of just wasn't the Gothic era just full of beauty and light and mystery and, the ruins of it, secrets it keeps. that sort of fascination with Gothic and the old became a whole nother movement that you're going to see cycled through again. And now that you understand the original Gothic, you're going to see what that means and why that matters and where things kind of got like messed up in playing telephone down the line, and sort of how we got from point A to point right now in, you know, music. So the Baroque, this is kind of our last like iterations that we've been looking towards gotten here. I'm doing North versus South in this particular lecture because we've got some stuff going on in both. They don't sort of follow the same exact, you can tell stylistically that there's a North Baroque movement and a Southern Baroque movement. So we're going to be trying to suss out what makes it Baroque versus Manneristic, and what makes it Northern versus Southern. So those are kind of the points that we're going to shuffle through so that you can identify something as Baroque and what makes both the North and the South movements both truly Baroque, even if they've interpreted these kind of ideals differently. Again, when we had our High Renaissance, you'll notice here, since you can still see me, 17th century, North versus South. Getting super vague with my dates again. Unlike the High Renaissance, where we sort of had these key events that cause the Renaissance to have officially begun with the Great Exchange, and then the day that music died, the day the Renaissance died, we cut it off when our big rock stars passed away. So the Mannerist movement kind of moves on from there in the reaction, but then where Mannerism and Baroque sort of end and begin depends on the region, the artist. There are people simultaneously working in Mannerism still while the Baroque is evolving. And so it depends. And when the Baroque sort of ended officially, it depends. So vaguely the 17th century. I'd say 1600, you have artists like Caravaggio, who is a Baroque master. There's nothing Manneristic about him. He's Baroque. And then on into, I mean, that's spilling in. We were looking at some El Greco pieces that same year, different artists, different region, different tastes. So they worked separately and continued. So it depends on where you are, one decade to the next, one artist to the next. So being vague with my dates, but that also means that you don't have like a key date thing that you can look at and be like, oh, 1499, nailed it, right? You've got those giveaways with something like the High Renaissance. Whereas in the Baroque, even if it's like Italy, 1602, depends, can I see the thing you're talking about, right? So no hard dates for you. There might be hard dates in the book. There might be hard dates in other documentaries that you look at, but asterisk that it's more nuanced than that. So we're going to be looking at sort of three separate Baroque movements. We've got the North, the Protestants in the Low Countries. And again, I think you've had that wind up for what the Renaissance in the North looked like. It looked different than the South because the Protestants were a different religious group with different Christian ideologies. We had a different economic base. The power structures were different. So that meant like who had money to be patroning the arts was a whole different game in the North versus the South during that period. The South, we've got this counter-reformation, the Catholic double down on shock and awe, education, edutainment, and emotion, drama. In the South, the Catholics are trying to use art to, I don't know, save souls, keep Catholics, I guess. It was like their propaganda mission in the Baroque in the South, with major artists like Caravaggio, who's going to be our king star today. I'm not saying he's my favorite person in history, but I love his art. I've found it moving since I was young, before I even knew what Baroque was. I thought he was a Renaissance painter. We'll talk about why 12-year-old me could have been so misinformed, and how you can tell right away that that's not what the Renaissance looked like. It's not what Michelangelo's paintings look like. There's something going on. and that something going on is the stuff that we've borrowed from the Mannerism movement. So you got North and South, but I said 3 Baroques. France. So France was Catholic, but we've got this extreme absolute monarchy going on. You know, the Louis, 14, 15, 16, it goes poorly after that. So we're moving towards a state power structure, not a church power structure. So they're kind of that middle ground between the Protestant, wealthy middle class merchants of the North who just have a whole different thing going on. So who's buying, who's patroning the arts is wealthy middle class merchants. Protestants aren't into flash during this time, like no bling bling. Modesty and humbleness and things were part of that ideology. In the South, you've got the super Catholicism going on as your major patron of the arts, and this major, like, deliberate movement towards doubling down on art for religious purposes, like we were seeing before the Renaissance. So a lot of that early stuff from the first couple weeks, we've got the same reasoning behind it, the same focus, but obviously a much more developed sense of artistic style. And then France is kind of neither of those things. Like, France is Catholic, but when you have this absolute monarchy, this absolute power structure, the power is in a different spot than just at the Vatican in Italy. So different reasons for the art, who's buying it, who's patroning it, what the political message is French monarchy. So they've got a third thing going on. So we will look at all 3. We'll try to keep all 3 straight. I think I even have a nifty bullet pointed slide for you. Right, I'm going to move through these with my head in the frame now. Apologies, when I take a beverage break, you'll actually be able to see it now instead of just an awkward pause. But I thought this also might help with the engagement for both of us. So, Peter Paul Rubens, The Elevation of the Cross, 1610, 1611. That's what we're looking at here. It is a triptych. We got 1, 2, 3 panels. They fold. Triptych. Remember the 2-panel one, like the Albert Alfdorfer was a diptych. Die is 2. We don't get crazy after that. More than 3 is a polyptych. Poly, as in many, many panels. So I think we saw a 9 or 11 paneled piece in the documentary from last week. Polyptych. After 3, we stop counting. All right, so we've got a high saturation of color here, right? It's almost like when you get to mess in Photoshop to really punch up the colors and the saturation, which isn't naturalistic. They're sort of artificially pumped up colors here. You've got built up application. I know that you really can't see that here. Impasto. We talked about that as a term just briefly last week, I believe. Impasto is where you're building up the paint to, like, it's a little bit 3-dimensional. There's a texture to it, because oil paint is beautiful, and like paint for paint's sake is beautiful. You can see the streaks of pigment running through that like oil suspension, and it just glistens, and it's beautiful. So impasto, having sort of a texture to the paint to add to how the light catches it, is developed during this period. Rembrandt's the king of that, if you choose him for your Baroque artist profile. More on that in a bit. But, right, so we've got directionality going on in here where you've got these diagonals. Do you see how we've almost got like a corner to corner composition here? Both with the bodies as well as sort of highlighting with the light source there. I think the crowded space is very Mannerist here, where he's sort of created some of that like tension and drama with just like a pack of muscly, topless male bodies. You know, it feels very sort of visceral, very meaty, and a little bit chaotic. There's a lot going on in that space. So the full triptych, though, if you look at it, it's a W, right? You've got this coming here with these people, especially this sort of cut of light right here. And then we come up with these kind of angled bodies, and then the main cut here across Christ on the cross. And then as we come up that third panel on the triptych, we've got this almost like cut of this spear from that rider on his horse. There's a lot going on there. That's a little bit more crowded, but if you notice, we've actually tried to make sense of some directionalities and make some balance in the composition, which is not something we would have necessarily tried to do in the Mannerist period. So we're hearkening back to understanding mastery of composition and using it when we see fit to prove a point and do a thing. I think it's just, this is such a great mismatch of the two inspirations for the Baroque. We've got the High Renaissance and we got Mannerism. Note the strong contrast of light and dark. That is one of our terms, tenebrism. So you've got this dramatic lighting, like light lights and dark darks, and not that realistic middle space of lighting like we get in the High Renaissance. Raphael was not tenebrism. He was just like your average, lovely blue sky day. Whereas this is sort of bringing in the smoke machines and the ring lights to sort of make some dramatic lighting. And that's the word drama. If we played like a popcorn game with that, you would win so many times today. I'm going to say it so much. So why we have this lighting? For drama. Why we sort of choose to crowd. We learned in Mannerism the sort of emotional cues that you can create in the art. Like when you make this claustrophobic space, it is kind of stressful to look at, right? It feels tense. So he can create that to sort of portray the drama of raising Christ onto the cross here at this very moment of action through that Mannerism crowding and kind of creating a little bit of chaos around there to bring some tension to the piece. It is not a perfect 3-3-3 foreground, midground action background like we have in the High Renaissance, but we're getting a bit more contextual environment than we got in Mannerism. So we're borrowing from both. Like there's a lovely background here. It creates some depth to the space. It creates a realistic sense of space. No comfortable foreground, just like Mannerism took away our foreground, but remember that sort of presses us closer to the action. So it creates, like forces some of that emotional connection with the viewer. So if we're going for drama and we're going for a visceral experience, then we're going to use all those top tricks from Mannerism, because what Baroque is borrowing that perfect High Renaissance classical ability to give a realistic and perfect human body, give a realistic and perfect natural representation of an animal, a plant, a space, but then make it somehow better by adding in more drama. So how can we make this more of an experience for you as a viewer by making it a dramatic experience? Not traumatic with a T, dramatic, like drama. So we've got the dramatic lighting. We've started to like push the claustrophobic pile of too many extras on the sets. We've taken away that comfortable foreground to kind of distance you from the action. You're right up in it again, just like in Mannerism. But there's still more composition and control to this than Mannerism, right? The people are also far more deliberately realistically portrayed. We almost have some figura serpentinata happening, but there's a lot more movement to this piece. So the guy with like the back bend that's pushing the cross up right under Jesus there in the center. Yeah, he's in a back bend that's almost a figura serpentinata, but there's clearly a lot of motion happening here. Like this is the moment where we're pushing it up. We're staking that cross up. So you're seeing this kind of as just like a deadlift moment and not like an awkward, painful, static pose like mannerism kind of tried to portray that uncomfortable position. So instead of portraying uncomfortable or artificial distorted figures, this is just portraying that movement, that sort of grunting uplift moment when the cross got lifted. Note how we have a piece of paper nailed to the top of the cross with a whole bunch of writing on it to explain stuff. Who does that remind you of? The North. Northern Renaissance. We love just like writing words on our canvas. Making little post-it notes in the middle of the canvas saying who the person is or signing the painting. So you got some North going on, you got some High Renaissance South going on, but you got some mannerism going on for added drama. I say South for High Renaissance. If you look at this horse over here, that's like a dead copy of the horse cartoons from Leonardo da Vinci's Battle of Anghiari. Whether or not Rubens actually saw it at one point and made sketches and was inspired by it, probably. I mean, I can't say, like, no one's like, oh yeah, we saw him in that piazza that one day in February. He definitely saw it. Like, I don't know, but that is so dead on a Da Vinci horse from the charge in the Battle of Anghiari mural that is lost to time, by the way. All we have are his planning cartoons now, and descriptions of it. So there's North and South notes of influence here. There's High Renaissance influences. Notice how our color palette has gone back to strong, rich primary colors, not weird, pukey, sour mannerism colors, but they're sort of pumped up a bit with the pigment, and it kind of goes with that pumped up lighting. So we've borrowed the palette, we've just dramatized it. So I think this Rubens piece is great to sort of help pick apart everything that's going on in the Baroque, where we are borrowing from the North, the South, High Renaissance, mannerism, but we're making something totally new with the skill set that we can gather from all those things. Rubens, I'm going to use him as examples for a lot of things because he's Mr. Baroque, but he won't be on a test for you to be like, name that tune, North or South. He was a Northerner. Peter Paul Rubens doesn't sound very Italian, but he studied in Italy, and he did work in the North, and he did work in the South. So he is influenced by everything going on in the regions. So he's always going to be sort of I don't know, a remix. Like he's bringing it all together. So he's never going to have that distinctive Northern style because he's seen the South and he's been influenced by it in his training and his experience. And he's never going to become like a total Italian about it either because he's got those Northern roots. And when he goes back to continue working in the North, so he's always going to be both North and South, but always Baroque. So he's a great example, but I'm not going to force you to say whether or not Rubens is North or South because he embodies aspects of both. All right, let us look at some other stuff that's going on. So this is a very different piece. We've got Judith Lester. So we have some ladies today. She's not the only one. So this is very Baroque, but a very different kind of composition, right? Whereas Rubens, it's clear that he's sort of messing with that composition of tons of figures like we have from Raphael with the mastery, and then we're like cramping them together to like get our mannerism tension going on. This looks much more like wholly Northern influence, right? We're not evoking Raphael here in any way. But what do you notice that is similar in some moves here? So skeleton holding a skull with a timer and a flame. Um, that's dramatic. Certainly, we're borrowing from that late Northern Renaissance of telling elaborate stories, telling moralistic stories with our art. So, what are we saying here? I know you're not in the room, which is why sometimes these get a bit like, well, let me tell you. What are we seeing here? We're seeing a memento mori. Remember, that's a term for remember you die. Those became quite popular, certainly in the North, certainly with the Protestant movement more so. That it's that reminder of our own mortality, and that we need to live right now the first time. Live properly the first time, not like YOLO live right now, but rather no, be a good person for the now. So we've got a memento mori happening with the skeleton and the skull and the timer. He's holding that candle, which gives us this very bizarre central lighting source. That's one heck of a 1,000-watt candle for how much it's lighting up our figure on the right there in his bright red motley suit. But she's giving you that very dramatic lighting. She's giving you some of that like flashlight under the face. It was, let me tell you a story. She's giving you that dramatic lighting, which is very Baroque drama. A memento mori, even though we've seen those in the Northern Renaissance, they're normally just like a skull tucked over in the corner because we love our symbolism, and you play like a seek and find game where you're looking for them. Where here in the Baroque, like you don't have to look too hard to find the memento moris in the middle of the painting. So it's not so much a symbolism strewn around to fill in the details. It is the reason for the piece. He's the central figure, really. So dramatic story told dramatically. Christ on the cross. We have, Christ on a cross by himself in many, many, many portrayals of that. But the Baroque, Rubens, he chose to show the minute that everybody's hoisting that cross up. We've got to show a lot of movement. We got to show a lot of drama. So if we're going to pick, all right, you want me to do a scene, I'm going to pick the most dramatic moment in that scene to portray. Very Baroque. So this is Baroque. We got the light source. We got the drama. We got the dramatic subject matter. This is very Northern in that we've got that symbolism, that allegory, telling a story. And being, it's still kind of a religious Protestant ideology here, but it's also generally a moral tale. It's not necessarily a religious piece, but rather like a morals and ethics piece. So that's also a bit Northern in that it has no direct connections to the church or a church. Meanwhile, down south, we got the Catholic Counter-Reformation going on. So, under direct patronage of the Catholic Church, we've got Italy, Spain, Flanders. I know Flanders is geographically north, but they were ruled by Spain at the time, so Spain. So Giuseppe di Ribera here has the Immaculate Conception, 1635. So this is where we're kind of going with the idea of the Immaculate Conception. Everybody knows that, or I assume most people have heard the story that Jesus was born immaculately. His parents didn't do it. His mom was a virgin, and she became pregnant from the Holy Spirit. This piece is also telling us that Mary was also Immaculate Conception. So not only was Jesus born without sin, but the vessel in which he was born from was also born without sin. So Mary was conceived without any stuff between her parents. We have Mary being elevated during this period to be this sort of liaison between God and humanity. Certainly Jesus was that figure, but when Jesus is sort of explained into the Holy Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost all being one thing, that no longer makes him like a liaison representative. That just makes him an aspect of God. So that position that sort of becomes vacant once the Holy Trinity was established and pushed as the standard Catholic canon, meant that Mary was then elevated into that role of liaison between heaven and earth, God and humanity. So this piece is representing that. You can see that we've borrowed a lot more from the High Renaissance in the way that her face is a standard High Renaissance beauty. We're borrowing from how we represent figures, how we represent form. All that fabric is like High Renaissance satin perfection. We've even got our like Christ or God up at the top with his arm over his head, which we've seen in a couple of High Renaissance pieces from the South. So we've got a lot of the way that each of these characters is portrayed is very High Renaissance. I studied Raphael, and you remember Raphael, where he's got his Madonna up on a cloud with the green curtains on either side and the cute little cherubs underneath. This is very reminiscent of her general pose, facial expression, demeanor, everything. So this is Raphael-esque, but we've got a little bit more drama in our lighting. And if you start to look at the overall composition, that whole foreground, midground, background thing is kind of all messed up. What you're seeing back there with like, it's sort of, there's nothing behind her. It's just like gold. And then all of a sudden you look and there's hundreds of gold on gold little baby face cherub drawing outlines. And then there's like a window and some other cherubs. And then there's some stars. Like there's a very trippy thing going on in the background there, that you've got this, it's called special expansion. And it's this sort of Baroque way that like we may take away your foreground. And in this one, there is not much foreground to speak of, but there is certainly more than what we've seen with Rubens, where you've got special expansion, which is sort of that like, it might be infinite space. We've got sometimes like it's nothing, it's just color, it just sort of fades into some shadowy meh, versus like something like this where there's details added into the background, but they do nothing to sort of orient you in a three-dimensional space. Like they don't help me feel a fixed three-dimensionality to it. Unlike Rubens, who did center us and ground us in that like forest. We got some rocks, we got some trees, we've got some vanishing point perspective going on. Like he grounds us in a real sense of space with how he feels in that background. Versus the Ribera here, the more you look at that background, the more confused you are about like, where are we and what is this? That is special expansion. So when you kind of can't describe, it's not like it's just nothing amorphous. There's stuff back there, but it's like crossing your eyes to try to figure out the vanishing point or any kind of illusion of depth. There is no illusion of depth. And the fact that we can kind of get weird about the use of space, even though everything else about this piece is sort of very High Renaissance and what it borrows, the way the composition creates this trippy sense of space is very thank you mannerism for freeing our shackles of reality. So we've got special expansion here, and that's where you like, there's stuff in there, but it does zero to orient you to a sense of space. It actually just messes up your sense of space even more. This piece is a great example of special expansion. So royalty with divine authority. The Catholic Church is divine legitimacy. Protestant humanism, where we're just going for like ethical messages a la Judith Lester, versus kind of trying to establish that legitimate authority for souls. So it's market-driven style. It's mandates on culture. The patronage of the Catholic Church during this time. We had the Council of Trent. This is a very important moment in the Catholic Church because they developed a policy, like a mandate, to excite and teach. So they started just pouring tons of money into art patronage, commissioning works of art with this drama that was afforded by the Baroque just totally worked for them because it's exciting, it's dramatic. So telling the same Bible stories as before that they've always been telling in their art for hundreds of years, but adding this excitement. So art was being commissioned to excite and to teach, and those were the two mandates of this propaganda campaign for religious education by the Catholic Church from the Council of Trent. So in comes one of our, I mean, this is 1635, so we're well into Council of Trent here. Caravaggio, he is everything the Catholic Church wanted in their art, not in their people. You're going to watch your documentary on Caravaggio today, and it's going to be amazing. But it's one of those, like, he's one of my artistic heroes. I think his paintings are some of those most moving ever done. But, like, I double down on the don't ever want to meet my heroes because it sounds like he was a horrible person. It'll be fun. You'll enjoy it. Caravaggio, this is the deposition from the cross. So once again, before this, if we were going to do the crucifixion of Christ, we might just have like Christ on a cross, the same kind of like crucifix that people have as jewelry. It's like this shorthand symbol of that whole event. Whereas now in the Baroque, we are getting more dramatic. We're trying to shock and awe and excite. Rubens chooses putting up the cross. Caravaggio chooses that moment when we're pulling his body down from the cross. So, tenebrism. This is definitely tenebrism. Just like Da Vinci had his special word for that misty something or other that was in the background, sfumato. We give Caravaggio, I mean, not just him, but he's kind of the king of it, a special word for extreme tenebrism, chiaroscuro. And that was a term in your week 1 art toolkit for terms to talk about art. So you've kind of got like medium and well done for this dramatic lighting. So tenebrism is the dramatic use of light. I would say that Judith and Rubens, both tenebrism, right? We've got these sort of spotlights. It looks more dramatic than like a real life setting would be without sort of manipulating the light sources. Caravaggio here, however, you can see there is no background to sort of understand. It's just blackness, right? It goes from like high highlights, dark shadows, blackness. So when that's just black in the back, that's called chiaroscuro. So that's in your notes already, but this is an excellent example of that like super tenebrism that is chiaroscuro. So single diagonal. Let's look at the directionality here. Once again, we're borrowing from the perfection of the High Renaissance. We know how to do a composition. We know how to create directionality in a composition. We know how to do the human form perfectly. So we can go back to, we've got a double vanishing point perspective happening here. If you look at the bottom, the point of the corner of that piece of wood is sticking out. And so you've got perfect vanishing point perspective. I mean, he doesn't really bother giving us a background. I mean, we've got a little plant under there that is done. But there's still that attention to detail of vanishing point perspective. We've created a real sense of space, even with just that one little sort of shorthand hint of the wood that's pointing out at us. We've taken away the foreground. There is no background. It's just blackness. So we've ignored high Renaissance there, but then we've done these perfect high Renaissance figures. Perfectly portrayed. They have mass, they have depth, they do all the things to make that illusion. So we've got that sort of classically perfect training there. And then when we take the composition, we know how to create a clean composition. We just create a slightly more dramatic one. So we don't have vertical symmetry here. We've got an asymmetrical diagonal composition created by these bodies, these mourners, and Christ, who is the highlighted centerpiece here, and kind of creates that. So we've got a diagonal across here as our primary directionality, and then you've got this like almost perpendicular cutoff of Christ's body across the center of the piece. And that is the most highlighted, that is the brightest, that's the hardest to miss part of the whole thing. So it's all of the things that we love about the high Renaissance, that sort of perfection of human form, that perfection of being able to create the illusion of real three-dimensional space. But then everything we loved about mannerism, where we could break the rules to cause more drama, to sort of get rid of stuff that you don't want the person focusing on, so that you don't actually have to read the painting as formally. Like, it's hard to miss Christ's body in the center of this. Like, you don't have to know a whole lot about how to read art to just be hit by this scene. So kind of getting rid of the unnecessary extras like mannerism freed us up to do. Also, some of those key ways that mannerism taught how to evoke emotion, how to create tension, how to create drama with the composition, the use of bodies, the loss of that safe, comfortable foreground that we used to have to keep our distance from the action as the viewers. So we've got all the best parts of mannerism and all the best parts of the high Renaissance coming together to create truly moving art. And that is kind of the pièce de résistance that we have been working towards. I know I kind of like psyched you out that the first half of the semester was working towards the high Renaissance, and then I'm like, meh. I kind of painted it as a bit of an overall letdown, if I'm honest. So here we are. Here's what all of that was worth. And it's being used quite effectively by the Catholic Church in this Council of Trent patronage mission. So let's look at, meanwhile, in Rome, we have the Fountain of the Four Rivers. And this is a piece by Bernini, another one of your optional artists to enjoy next week. I'll get to that assignment later. So this is full of Baroque flavor because of all the sculpture and architecture and movement. But it gets to be like Baroque in 4 dimensions. So if you see here, we've got the 4 main rivers: the Danube, the Ganges, the Nile, and the Rio de la Fuente. So seeing the whole world as encapsulated in like 4 continents at this point in history. Each one is depicted with its own statues and movement. You can see the elephant here is pouring out the water for the Ganges. So we have an Indian elephant there. I can't see what's happening over there, and I don't want to misquote the order of them. But we've got 4 separate fountains that represent the 4 big rivers in the known world at this time. So there's a lot of movement here. It's telling stories. The figures themselves are perfect in their form and structure, but in perhaps more dramatic poses than would have been allowed or afforded in the high Renaissance. You can see the lady over there with her arm right up above her head, like falling, because we're creating movement. You've got horses running through this center cave area here in full gallop with their manes waving. It's rather, there's a lot of movement in that sculpture, the way that it is composed. The other just totally cool thing if you think about the High Renaissance, and I'm not trying to say it was boring because it was one of the most magnificent turns in artistic history. I hope I made that clear. I'm trying not to trash on it, but like it wasn't the end. We didn't all die 400 years ago, artistically anyway. It would have been a controlled, harmonious, even, balanced thing, right? You would have had a fountain that, like, if there was water pouring out on the left at 18 inches high, there would have been water pouring out at the right at 18 inches high. Everything would have had to have been in perfect balance and harmony and squared up. There wouldn't have been anything like dynamic or exciting about it, which I'm kind of glad that this piece was done in the Baroque, because it's so awesome to be able to walk around this fountain. So you just take a lap around the edge of this fountain, and the sound is also constantly changing. There's movement in the noise because the 4 different rivers are represented by those 4 different spouts. They are coming out of the fountain at different heights, at different sort of spray angles, I guess, and at different speeds. So more water is pouring out of like just sort of like a big heavy tube with the elephant, and he's a little bit lower to the ground. So like it's this deep kind of booming, foaming sound. And then when you get over to the side that you can see here on the left, it's sort of being sprayed out much, much higher, much farther, with like force ejecting it further, but smaller little sprays. So it comes out in this fan, and it's got this like higher pitched sound. So as you're moving around, just taking a lap around this fountain, the sound of the water is constantly changing as you're shifting from hearing 1 predominantly towards hearing 2 in harmony, and then the other one, and then the 3rd in harmony, then the other one. It's so dynamic. It's totally the Baroque in 4 dimensions, including sound. So this piece is so great because it captures everything that we love about the High Renaissance with the forms and the figures, but adds that drama that we can sort of thank mannerism for freeing up for us. But doing it with, I don't know, just a deliberate sense of beauty that only the Baroque gives us. So this piece would not have been possible without everything that we've sort of studied in the second half of the semester. So Bernini, great sculptor. This is probably my favorite piece by him. All right, so let us move on to Meanwhile in France. I don't speak French. I try my hardest. I apologize. I've had some native French speakers in my classes, and I just like, I'm sorry if you are one. I'll do my best. I speak Italian. I'm pretty comfortable with those, but French, not the same thing. Galli, Triumph of the Name of Jesus. So you can see that this is late into the 17th century. This is a fresco with some stucco adding. So like we've got a painting, but we also have 3-dimensional sculptural elements. So wow, this is busy. Very, very exciting though, right? So what do you see that we've come to know from the Baroque? We've got dramatic lighting, right? This is like a totally wild lighting situation here that I think is fantastic, with the bright light source here in the center of the dome. It really, with the directionality of all those bodies and the composition, really makes us feel like we're looking straight up into heaven. You can see there's sort of white on white, that cross there in the middle. It's this beautiful sort of vision of heaven. And then we get this great sort of texture and depth to it by seeing the underside of these clouds that are in shadow because they're kind of between us and that light source. So great use of lighting, totally dramatic, really dramatic composition of bodies. We get a little bit of like Raphael, and like we can make a crowd look composed and balanced as we are sort of approaching heaven here, but then it gets pretty chaotic as we're moving over onto these clouds closer to us and things. So we're telling the story through that use of like chaos and tension versus, you know, more organized and elegant on the other side, closer to heaven. So this is a great example of the Baroque where we get all the drama, but are able to sort of give a realistic illusion of space in a great way. With the manneristic, we can create tension and drama through our use of composition and kind of messing with what's perfect to make you feel something. So, conversion back to the true church, overwhelming power of religion and the church, emphasizing that direct lineage of the Pope, sometimes the King. So these are those sort of awe-inspiring moments, shock and awe with art, that both the South and France were using as part of that political narrative. So, Rigaud, Louis the 14th. So same problem with legitimacy. The Pope is trying to give you that absolute authority over all things heaven related, which is obviously a direct counter statement to the Protestant movement that was happening in the North. So the Pope is trying to work very hard to establish his legitimacy and his importance. The King is kind of doing the same thing in France. Like, he's got the issue of absolutism and the divine right to rule. That's what he's kind of like doubling down on. So there's more of a classical style in the Baroque in France specifically. But we also get something that the way that we make the drama, the way that we make it more ornate or more interesting in France for the Baroque is more is more is more. So the French Baroque is sometimes called the classical Baroque because it's the one of the three that really goes back to the ancient classical gods and things. You'll notice in the South, especially when we're getting very much back into high Renaissance figure and form and space, we are not getting back into high Renaissance pagan classical gods and goddesses and fairies and nymphs and stuff, because that's not what the Catholic Church is paying for. They are paying for religious narratives to excite and educate, not messing around with pagans. So you're not going to see that classical, direct, obvious classical influence on Southern Baroque, because although the idea of the ideal human form certainly is borrowed from that classical period as established in the High Renaissance, besides borrowing how to make a perfect man look like the perfect man and a perfect woman look like the perfect woman, we're not borrowing from that classical philosophy. We're not borrowing from the Greek gods. We're not borrowing from that pagan classical era at all. Whereas in France, we are. So this piece of Louis XIV, this is the Sun King. Apollo is his motif. So the old sun god from ancient Greece, Apollo, is his kind of like call sign, I guess. It's kind of, I mean, I don't know if anyone would have said it out loud at the time, but we are going with, if the Pope is absolute authority over all things Christian related, the Sun King is evoking Apollo, an ancient god. So he's taking his legitimacy claim to be older than Christ himself. Like, Jesus wasn't even born when Apollo was the sun god. So kind of moving back to like, I can trace my ancestors 100 more generations than you, Mr. Pope, for legitimacy. There's much more control in French style, because I think of all of the Baroques, this one is the most politically oriented propaganda style. I know that I'm kind of making the South sound like that, but it was an exciting time in art in the South where it was to educate and inspire and create that sense of awe, right? Excitement. Besides that, the Council of Trent didn't exactly say how whereas King Louis XIV was very much dictating that. So there's much more control. I mean, Versailles is the French Baroque like prison of their own making for the aristocrats of France. So his propaganda stronghold was controlled luxury. He invited all the dukes and the like ruling. You know, if you were a wealthy landowner, you owned land, you had your own personal wealth from that, and so you had power and authority, and you know, a few hundred or even a few thousand men slash instant army at your beck and call. Like they come to you because you're the guy who pays them and you're the guy who makes sure that they eat in the winter, not the king. Like you're sort of their first line of authority. So the king knew that the landholders, the dukes, actually hold quite a lot of real power in the country. And I think he had seen it before in other countries when revolts and things happen. So he invited all the dukes to Versailles to live. He charged them for their rooms and their apartments and their meals and everything else. So he made like quite a hot amount of money off of it as well, which was genius. But the other thing that was genius about it is he removes them from their central points of power and brings them to his. So they're not home giving direct orders to the people of their dukedom. They're not home making those decisions, negotiating contracts, making friends with knights. Like they're not there. They're in Versailles. So the sort of next face of authority is no longer that local duke because he's in Versailles with the king. So he's kind of draining their power that comes from knowing and being close to their constituency. He basically like dazzled them with a very decadent lifestyle, drunken wild parties nonstop, that they got charged like, you know, serious hotel room rates for. But he took away their power from ruling at home, moved them to the central location where he could watch them at court, spy on them, manipulate them, and bilk them for money in an incredible way that if they couldn't pay their charges at Versailles, they were sort of like totally shunned out of society for being broke and not worth anything. And many went broke because they weren't minding their land. So it was this great consolidation of power move that he made, and everybody sort of volunteered to buy into it, because it was this, you know, fantastic place of where the powerful go to influence the king, and like nonstop parties and shiny and like they got mesmerized and he sapped their power. It was an incredibly clever consolidation of power in the country, because Louis pretty much ended up having all of it. From this very shrewd move of just moving them into like the shiniest, fanciest place that you could possibly imagine, which is Versailles, and just making it like a nonstop drunken fun time. So the Baroque. Let's look at, excuse me. So the point of that like control speech was that the French Baroque is called the French Baroque. It's also called the Classical Baroque. So if you're ever reading in the book, watching a documentary, and somebody refers to it as the Classical Baroque, you're not like, which one is that? Or, oh, there was another one. It's the French Baroque. To delineate between the two, the South, with our Reformation, is actually called the Free Baroque. So it doesn't have that same control. Though it still has a message, it's less like militant propaganda like France is. So the Free Baroque is the Southern Baroque. The Northern Baroque is also sometimes called the Dutch Baroque because its center was Amsterdam. So all three Baroques can be their sort of title of the location, but they all have a nickname. So remember those nicknames, write them down. The Southern Baroque is also the Free Baroque. French Baroque is also classical Baroque, and Northern Baroque is also Dutch Baroque. So 6 Baroques, but only 3. Everybody's got a fake name, AKA. So look at this piece here. This Apollo attended by nymphs. Very classically inspired. Obviously, it's Apollo. We're invoking the sun god. We've got some political propaganda that's quite evident here. So this piece is at Versailles. Compared to the Apollo Belvedere, again, I don't have to put him up again. You've memorized him. But you can see that very inspired by the Apollo Belvedere, very inspired by classical works of art. But unlike classical works of art where it's one character, right? The Apollo Belvedere is just Apollo standing there with his cloak. We've added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 backup singers. No, 7. No, 6. More is more is more. So instead of like putting some fruit on the pedestal, we've added 6 more full-size figures. More is more is more. So this is way more busy and elaborate than a classical Greek statue. So even if the people are portrayed and sculpted precisely like a classical sculpture, it would be easy for you to differentiate that this isn't a real classical sculpture because it's so busy. There's more is more is more going on here. So we've got this elaborate, more action, more details, more plates and urns and goblets and harps and people and plates and harps and grapes and just more. It's just busy. So we've got that. All these extra figures for support, very overstated. Like the classical roots don't do that. So it's like that, but more. So that's how we create our drama, is with just like more elaborate scenes, just more stuff, more people, more attendees. So that's kind of a key moment of the French Baroque. But also notice the control. So we have these kind of rough cut pillars here. A fountain is coming down around that, but that rough cut pillar creates a back to this piece. So you as a viewer can only see it from a very narrow angle when you come around the corner of that like grotto wall, see it from the front, and then that wall cuts off your view again. So they may be done in the round, which you remember is just our way of saying statues that are finished all the way around. So, or maybe they're not, we'll never know. That's very French Baroque, that it's so controlled over what you see. So they've controlled your viewing angle. They've controlled the amount of viewing angle that you get. You're never going to be able to walk up behind this fountain and like catch Apollo off guard. You're never going to see his butt. You're never going to, I don't know, stand above him or something. Like you can't get there. There's like a moat. So it's always making sure that you're sort of below and looking at his best angle in a very controlled sort of way, which just screams propaganda. It's lavish, but it's orderly and it's controlled, and there is a very clear, strong message. So very French, very Louis XIV. He's got a message. He's here to like, ooh, shiny, but also only the way I say. And I think that that is kind of the key to the French Baroque. All right, here's another piece, Nicolas Poussin, Holy Family on the Steps. So you can see here a huge influence in the High Renaissance. We've got like Raphael all over this. We've got some classical architecture going on in there. So think about Madonna in the Meadow. I think I've got yes. So here's Raphael's Madonna in the Meadow. We got our foreground, our midground, our background. We've got this equilateral triangle thing going on. Our lovely composition sort of closing its circuit back and forth around it for our primary, secondary, and tertiary focal points. And then we go back to this piece. Very similar. We've got the same Madonna and two kids. We've added two more figures. One of them is questionably irrelevant, but we've used lighting to sort of create now a triangle, but instead of that perfect equilateral one, we've created like an isosceles triangle. We've created an unequal and imbalanced triangle. So we're still going for a triangular composition. We've just gone for a secondary shape, not a balanced, equal, perfect one, but one of those secondary shapes, like an oval instead of a circle, a rectangle instead of a square. We've got a non-equilateral triangle going on here. So we've got this off-center isosceles, because I'm really not counting that dude. But even if you did, we've got way too wide of a base. So we've still got an irregular secondary triangle shape there. Foreground is right up against the edge of the canvas. We've got that like basket, the urn, the box. So we don't have any comfortable distance like the Renaissance. So while he may have studied Raphael, he's still bending those rules to suit him. Also notice our point of view. Right here, we've kind of got that straight on, lovely Madonna and Child in the meadow. Everything feels quite comfortable for our viewing angle. Here, we're very worm's eye, aren't we? We're sort of staring up this steep step, cutting off the ability to see their context and kind of just shooting up straight towards the sky. So you've got a perfectly high Renaissance use of space, illusion of three-dimensional vanishing point perspective. He's created the architecture beautifully, but he's sort of twisted it to move your point of view to sort of a weird, more dramatic point of view. So it's very classical setting, very classically inspired. We've got the classical architecture and things, but then we've sort of twisted it a bit, made it a little more irregular, put it a little more off balance, including that extreme point of view, kind of breaking apart or doing a riff on that primary triangle, that primary shape of the equilateral triangle, and then adding a couple more characters because it's France and it's what we do in the Baroque. All right, so let us move on from that to, meanwhile, in the north, Johannes Vermeer. I'm a big fan. If anybody has watched The Girl with the Pearl Earring with Scarlett Johansson from maybe, oh gosh, it's getting on now, at least a decade, that does a good job of, I don't think that's who the girl with the pearl earring was. That's fiction. But it does kind of a great job of highlighting Vermeer's workspace. They recreate, because this room, you can pick out a Vermeer because he paints them all in the corner of his studio, which is this room. He'll put different furniture, different set pieces, but it is that corner with those windows. They do a great job of that. They do a great job of exploring the idea that he may have used optics, like ancient proto cameras, just to be able to take light and project it onto a piece of paper or something. So there's a lot of speculation on whether or not he used optics, and how he ground and mixed his paints, what a lot of his process was, which made him sort of better than his colleagues and competitors living in Amsterdam at the same time. So I think that's a great one if you're not like, oh yeah, the girl with the pearl earring, she was his servant and he was gonna hit that, but she was Protestant, didn't want to. No, none of that. Ignore that. But the rest of it, pretty good. So I know, minus the plot, it was a great movie. But it gives us those nods to understanding kind of the space and the economy and the situation for a commission artist in the 17th century in the Netherlands at that time. So it really helps you understand sort of the context of the Northern Renaissance through kind of what we know about the life of Vermeer. So anyway, this is a Vermeer. So the thing about the North, once again, like Northern Renaissance, we had that cool lighting where you've just kind of got those like gray, overcast, foggy days that are the Netherlands. We've got that again here because it's still the Netherlands. But we've gone to use of light for our extreme drama because, once again, like, we're Dutch, not Italian. We don't need to like scream the drama. We just, add it in where we can. You'll notice that the lighting or the scene is going to be more dramatic than what we've seen in the Northern Renaissance, but certainly not as wild as the South. Protestant, but more humanist. I'm not going to say that the church was not that big a deal, but as far as art and artistic expression goes, we're looking at more private commissions, wealthy merchants who are still trying to stay reasonably outwardly modest. That whole idea of the genre painting is like still going strong. Remember we talked about a genre painting is just a painting of everyday life. So we had the goldsmith's shop before. Here we've got the geographer. I mean, clearly this is staged in Vermeer's workshop, but it kind of gives you that like daily life of a person who's not particularly historically special. He was probably able to commission this to put up in his cartography shop to be like, Vermeer. Kind of says that his cartography shop was doing great. But it comes down to us as a really important vignette of daily life for sort of those wealthy middle-class professionals, understanding the life of people that aren't royals, which we don't get in a lot of periods in a lot of areas. So this is kind of a great movement for historians to kind of get more of the net of context for what life was like, what times were like for people who weren't just the notables that made it into the history books. So the mostly private buyers, so it's going to be portraits of family members, or like a dude who is just a cartographer and not Duke of somewhere isn't likely going to be sort of smug enough to sit for a portrait just for sitting for a portrait. So it's going to be something akin to like a slightly artificial genre painting. He's just going to be a dude doing his business. And we get a lot of those from Vermeer. We get a lot of those from Rembrandt, where it's kind of a way to get your portrait painted, but without seeming like you're that vain. So that's kind of the way that those are done, through like this genre painting style. Portraits, still lives. Rembrandt did some great still lives. Vermeer did a few as well, which also help us kind of capture some of the life ways of people in a great way. I love the Northern Baroque style as well. Like, I love me some Caravaggio, and I love the drama and the murder in the South. But I can also appreciate just sort of this pumping up the beauty of the natural world and the beauty of just the human experience that we're more capturing in the North. Again, with that humanism, we're getting some of those moral, ethical things like Judith Lester, but we're also getting just like daily life from, I mean, not average people, but people who wouldn't have been that special before the middle class developed, special enough to have these things documented about them. So I think that's kind of where we get this difference for very North versus very South, because like, who's buying and selling paintings? Who's commissioning them? What's their purpose? Is very, very different, just whole different worlds. But this idea of using everything we've learned from the Renaissance, being able to make it more painterly, more artistic, by not making it a perfect like photo documentary, but rather something more, is definitely also, that's Baroque, and the North is Baroque as well. So here we've got kind of a foreground, midground, background, dramatic use of light, but not so much with the hidden symbols here. I mean, we've got his cartography equipment, but that's just there as part of the genre painting. So you're not going to be finding like deep symbols of narratives and things, because this isn't a moral painting. This is not a religious painting. This is just a genre painting. So you don't have to look for weird symbols to tell you an elaborate story about how to live. Same with, let's look at Rembrandt here, The Slaughtered Ox. This is, I don't know, like, is it a still life? Is it a genre painting? It's a still life in the sense that, you know, usually like a table of fruit is a still life, but some dead birds on a table that we're going to cook for dinner later is also a still life, and Rembrandt did a fair few of those. So we've got The Slaughtered Ox, but if you look in the corner, you can see the woman who lives/works here. So that kind of borders it on, is it a genre painting? It's certainly not a portrait, but it is a portrait of a scene from everyday life during this period. The dramatic subject matter. I mean, again, this isn't like Christ coming down off the cross with Mary screaming with her hands up in the air in the background, but it's a pretty dramatic subject matter. It's not a bowl of fruit. It's a headless, eviscerated ox. So dramatic. Dramatic lighting. Here we've got tenebrism. You see how this is not as extreme chiaroscuro as Caravaggio. It doesn't just fade to black. We get a sense of space, but it's all darkness and shadow. So we get objects behind it. We get the wall. We get the ceiling. We've got a very good sense of realistic space. It's just all cast in shadow. So this is tenebrism, not chiaroscuro. The other thing that this is an excellent example of impasto. If you can, I don't know, look this piece up, really good resolution, and like zoom in, you will see that it is not actually as detailed as it appears, because a lot of those streaks and stripes of the muscle and the gristle and the sinew and the bone aren't separately painted colors of stripes. It's just sort of poorly mixed paint that then gets glomped on in huge, thick blobs. So you can see these individual strains of pigment running through the matrix of that oil paint. So it's impasto. There's paint for paint's sake. There's a three-dimensionality to the paint. And that's kind of what makes this piece look so dramatically realistic, is it almost still feels like wet, which is kind of gross, but like really fascinating if you look at how he has that white just sort of loosely mixed in with those reds and browns and yellows, and it looks so realistic. And then when it gets so close up that it doesn't even look realistic anymore, it's still just like beautiful as you're watching this like lines of pigment like swimming in the oil paint. So impasto, Rembrandt was great with impasto. He could create so much detail in one single stroke because of his just like textured three-dimensional application of the oil paint. Very Baroque that we've got this dramatic subject matter, dramatic lighting. Very Northern in that it is a genre painting, a still life. You know, it just feels very like middle/working class, right? There's nothing like, I don't know, it doesn't have to be elevated to save your soul, and it doesn't have to be a portrait of a king to be worth painting. And that's kind of what the North is all about. The South, we've got, you know, portraits of popes and kings, or Jesus and God and Mary and the angels. It always has to be something like real big deal. And then in the North, the things that are the beautiful things worth capturing are just very everyday, mundane things, which I think is its own beautiful propaganda message of the North. So one more, I think. Okay. Yeah, one more new one. So this is another Vermeer. I just wanted to give you an example of, sometimes he did leave his studio. This is called plein air painting, where you like go outside with your canvas and just paint outside. My mom is a big plein air fan. So Baroque composition here. It is just like a harbor on a day. Looks like Delft, because Clouds. Yep. It's lovely. It's beautifully detailed. It's got that perfect vanishing point perspective happening. But if you notice, we have not gone with horizontal symmetry in that at the halfway point, you could cut it and have sort of even spaced. Like we don't have the horizontal symmetry balance. We've really pushed the horizon of those buildings down to give big sky. And the big sky has like lovely fluffy white clouds and blue sky, but we've also got that sort of dramatic shadowed dark gray one right up at the front, in the foreground, up at the top. Coming down, it casts some very great shadows on those buildings. I think it's very cool, or not cool as in cold, but like it's wicked interesting that he's chosen to put that dark cloud in front of us. So we've got the main source of light behind those front buildings. So you can see that the shadow is cast out onto the water towards us. Those like most detailed, most elaborate buildings that we can see the best are actually in shadow. And then as you go back into the town here, all of that is bathed in light. So it's a really interesting use of light and light source. It's a really interesting like push down of the horizon line to make this almost a sky scene that happens to have the line of the village in it. So I mean, or is it a genre painting? We got those two, like we got that little family by the boat. We got those two ladies down there probably doing their washing. No, it's a landscape, but it's bending the rules of a landscape, and that makes it very Baroque. And it makes it very northern that our drama is a cloud, but you can still see what that interesting use of light and kind of creating that drama has done for it, and quite a lot. Like this is very beautiful and it's very interesting because it's not the expected standard. And I think that's what makes Vermeer great in everything that he does. It's a dramatic sense of space. So he, brings it down a few notches from, say, like Rubens, but it still has the beauty and the drama that we would expect from Baroque, where we can choose the rules from our previous styles, bend them to suit our purpose, which is usually to inspire or drama. All right, let's just swing back to Rubens to close. Figures, the sense of space is complex. The color is controlled and deliberate. If you look at the reds now that we can kind of see that difference between what we've borrowed, what we've bent, you can see that the reds all follow this directionality again. So not only do we get the directionality from the composition, but he's added those flashes of color, and all of them are only splashed out on diagonals. There's no sort of accidental red filling in any other space. So he made it dramatic, like the Mannerist movements. He's crowding it, but he's also brought everything back under control, especially with his very deliberate use of color here. This is very free Baroque in that sense. Overall, I would say that even though Peter Paul Rubens was a world traveler, certainly this elevation of the cross, I think a lot of Rubens, if I had to categorize him, I'd say he was free Baroque, Southern Baroque, right? Free equals Southern. So he spent a year in Rome before he painted this, so he was truly inspired by the Southern. But it's all of these stylistic characteristics that make it very Southern. Exaggerated, it looks very high Renaissance Italy, but exaggerated, but not in that sort of like lavish more is more is more way that France would have done it. And I mean, it's clearly, we've got our Christian statement happening here, and we've chosen to make it dramatic through use of flesh and bodies and suffering and a dramatic scene choice. So we've got I mean, that's very Southern, isn't it? So, yes, I think this next one is somewhat useful. I will double check the language here and I will put this up in the folder for you, just so you don't have to feverishly write this down while I'm wrapping up. So just chill. I'll give you this info. Southern Baroque, again, remember we've got that Catholic Counter Reformation. We're trying to like keep souls Catholic. No more converting to Protestantism and losing them. Council of Trent, excite and educate the masses. So again, you don't have to be able to read the Bible to know the Bible stories because we have this art. Dramatic religious stories, special expansion, lighting is extreme and dramatic, but that's everybody, I guess. French Baroque or Classical Baroque. You've got Louis XIV, need for absolute power and divine right, harkening back to classical influence. So it's the only time you're going to see the Greeks popping up during this stylistic period. So it's dramatic and controlled points of view. Remember, there's always that lavish overdoneness, but it's still very like controlled on what you're allowed to see about it. Finally, Dutch Baroque, influenced by Protestantism, influenced by the wealthy middle class that existed in that era. Dramatic lighting, dramatic composition, but like private buyers, genre scenes. We can still create that drama, but it's mostly through use of light, and sometimes dead animal subject matter. If you're Rembrandt, that's about as edgy as he gets. He's so sweet. Anyway, impasto also creates drama, right? That like paint for paint's sake is just like unctuous and beautiful and something to fall into when you're looking at the painting. So I hope that helps for understanding how to tell the difference between the Baroque, but also how to tell the difference between the sort of three regional styles happening in the Baroque. They're all very Baroque still, but they're all quite distinct. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.